I want you to see something that you're not going to be able to read, and I'll explain it in just a moment, but I just want you to see it in its form. Now, if you can read that, good for you, because I can't either. But what I want you to see is all the text that's before you, and I want you to see the white, and I want you to see the red, and I want you to see the blue. And let me explain why we're looking at this. I've been trying to get us back on our regular, what I call regular sermon schedule that I had pre-made the year before. Last few Sunday nights, we have been off of our schedule, and I had good intentions on getting back on it tonight. But I read something today, and I couldn't let it go. And I wanted to know more about it, so I started looking at it, and then that made me realize something. We need to study about the general principle that's contained in all of this information that you can see before you. It's hard to read. And what this is a bill that's been placed before a group of people. And they're going to take a vote on whether they want to do this or not. And what it's going to do in its long term is tell people what they can say and what they cannot say. And that bothers me. It bothers me for this reason. And I want to give you the end of the sermon right now. It bothers me because God has already spoken on a number of issues. And we don't have the right to change those words. We don't have the right to be silent on those words. We have the right to obey the Lord. And as you know, and as I know, our world is different. And we'll talk about our world as we go through. Let me give you a little context of what we're studying. We're talking about something tonight that was just put before folks on June the 24th of 2019, just recently. And this was amended in June 24th of 2019. It was in the California State Legislature. And it's an assembly to give a bill, to place a bill, to make it into law. And this is what they put on the top of the bill: relative to civil rights. Now, there's a little meander we need to take for just a minute. There's not a person in this world who should be oppressed. There's not a person in this world who should be put down. There is not a person in this world who deserves harm. All people do deserve equal and fair treatment. But there is a standard in which equal and fair treatment is found. It's right before you and me. Now, let me give this little side note to this just so we squash any concept of this in our minds. Just because God opposes something does not mean that we pick up our pitchforks and go to the city square. You and I can oppose what God opposes while still loving this world. Our world doesn't see that concept. If you oppose someone in our world, or if you're opposed, maybe this is your reaction. You don't like it, and you're going to fight back. And that's how our world views every subject that comes along anymore. If you don't believe me, just watch the news, and you'll see this happen over and over again when someone feels oppressed. But what this bill is Bill 99 out of California. And we're not going to look at the whole list of things, but what this bill is being put together as a civil rights bill to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Now listen to this, people. And what they're saying is no one can speak ill of, no one can speak bad of, no one can tell someone that you can't live that lifestyle, no one can call it sin. That's a problem, folks. I hope you already see why that's a problem. Now, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to talk about that law anymore. But I wanted you to see it because that is the way our world thinks. But that creates a problem for you and me. It doesn't have to be this issue. It could be any other issue that God has already stated His word on. Whether God has given His disapproval or whether God has given His approval, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. That just happens to be the issue that's on the news right now. If God is for it, we'll be for it. If God is against it, we're going to be against it. But here's the problem. And it's not a problem on God's side, it's a problem on our side. How do we navigate that in the culture that we live? Because you and I know that's a difficult navigation, isn't it? So I prepared a lesson tonight entitled No Other Gospel that comes from Galatians 1 verses 11 and 12, and we'll get to that particular passage in just a moment. But what I want you to notice with me is the world, the gospel, and then I want you to notice this, the action. How do we navigate all of these things that come up? And most of the time, I'll go ahead and tell you, it's probably been political. Most of these things probably are not little things in regular everyday life. These are things that our world are crying about. How do we respond to them? What's our idea behind them? So let's see the action. Let's start off by talking about the world. Now go with me to John chapter 15. We're going to progress through three passages, two in the book of John, one in 1 John, that are just simply going to talk about the world. Just going to talk about the world and how the world lives, how the world thinks, what the world does, because I want you to see the world. And there's going to be a root cause and a root thing in these three passages that do exist. John 15:19 reads this way: If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a principle that if you haven't figured out, you will figure out. If you are a Christian, you will oppose the world. Here. Not here. It's not our opinions that oppose the world. It is the standard that God has set forth that opposes the world. If we were of the world would love us. Because we would be of the world, we would be like the world, we would live like the world. And this conversation would never happen in the world. But Jesus tells us here in John chapter 15 that we are not of the world, that we've been chosen out of the world. You see that? Out of the world. And therefore the world hateth you. Why? Because we're different. This brings us to that age-old discussion that happens time and time again in the New Testament of light, goodness, godliness, and darkness, sin, transgression, death. There is in our world good and evil. That's not going to change. But we're not of the world. Meander over to John chapter 17. And you have something that picks up in verse 14. And it's really interesting what happens in John chapter 14, or John chapter 17, verse 14. I want you to read just verse 14 first. It reads this way. Notice it's read. These are the words of Jesus. I have given them thy word, and the world hath hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Pause for a minute. It's Jesus speaking. Who is he speaking to? Well, go to John 17, verse 1. These words spake Jesus, if you didn't know who it was already, you now know, and lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father. What is Jesus doing? Jesus is engaged in prayer. John 17:1 is one of those passages that teach us our prayers are directed to the Father through the Son. We learn in other passages we pray to the Father. But Jesus here, while on the earth, if anyone who knew who the Father was, it is Jesus. He says in verse 14, I'm not of this world. He's not from here. He was from the beginning. He was from before the beginning. And Jesus says in verse 14, I have given them, now listen to this is crucial, thy word. The words that Jesus spoke, where did they come from? The Father. I have given them thy word. And the world hated them. What did the world hate? Jesus said to the Father, the world hated your words. Now, why does the world hate the words of God? Jesus tells us the answer. Because they are not of the world. Do you see the comparison that's happening here with the world? There is good and evil. There is truth and error. There is God and there is godless. Do you see the world? It will only exist in one of those two categories. Either we will be for God and with God, or we will be against God and without God. I've given them thy word. They hated it because it was not of the world. And Jesus said, even if I'm not of the world, verse 14. Now pick up in verse 15. I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but thou shouldest keep them from evil. They're not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. As thou hast sent me into the world, even so have I sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctified myself, that they might also be sanctified through, now listen to this, the truth. Through that which the world hates, we can be sanctified. So Jesus tells us here, it's the word that comes from the Father. It's the word that the world hates because it's not of the world. Jesus is not of the world. That means we must be living as if we're not of the world. But we can be sanctified in the truth. That's the difference, truth and error. Now go to 1 John. I want you to see this in 1 John. 1 John 2, verse 15. This is what's hard. This is what's difficult. I want you just in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, I want you to just look at the first word. Love. Now that's a good word. I'll tell you some things I love. I love my wife. I hope that I don't have to say that out loud, but I don't mind saying it out loud. I love my children. One of them's trying to get my attention over here. I love my children. I love what I do. I love my work. I love the Lord, don't you? I love that the Lord has made it possible for us to be forgiven, don't you? Boy, what blessings we have, what things we can love. I love friendship. I love a good hobby, don't you? Love's a good thing. As a matter of fact, I was talking to one of you in this room tonight. I won't tell who you are, but ladies, you can just be encouraged that one of your husbands said this. And I quote, "You just don't know what love is until you've been married this long." That come from one of you, men. The concept of love, how important marital love is. The word love, that's a good word, isn't it? Read the rest of the verse. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. We're talking about the world. What is your and I reaction to the world? I can't love the world. I can't love the thoughts of the world. I can't love the ways of the world. I can't love, now listen to this, I can't love the love of the world. I can't love the happiness of the world. Why? Because it's of the world. It's not of the Father. You see, the world is a very different place because the world is without truth. That brings us to point number 2, the gospel. And thus I want you to go with me to Galatians chapter 1, where we're going to talk about the gospel, and we're going to talk about another gospel that the people had been kind of tricked into. It's Paul here, and in verses 1 through 5, he talks about the evil of the world. He talks about where he came from. He talks about sin, but he also talks about Jesus and God the Father, who he says in verse 5, to whom be glory forever and ever. Our sin is the evil inside of this world, folks. But follow out what happens, the true gospel. Verse 6, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which you have preached, that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again. If any man preach any other gospel unto you than that which ye have received, let him be accursed. How many gospels are there? There's one. Now that tells you and me something. I already know where I stand. I just got to figure out where it's at. All the issues that are going to plague our world are already talked about in God's Word, whether we've recognized them or not. Whether the world has invented them or not, I'm convinced that the world still has things that it's going to invent. And Paul was telling them here, he marvels, it boggles, it blows his mind that they're already so confused. Verse 6, that they were brought unto another gospel, which is not another. Another in verse 6 is of a different kind. Another in verse 7 is of the same kind. But there be some that trouble you. Verse 8 and going down to verse 10, it's about God versus man. Look at verse 10. For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I just seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. If you want to please the world, you're going to have to give up the Word. That's what the world wants, remember? John chapter 17. Because the Word is not from this world. It doesn't matter what topic we're talking about. This world does not love the Word because it's not of this world. And Jesus says, I'm not of this world. And we learn right here, we're either going to serve God or we're going to serve man. Which one do you want to serve? Well, the answer is God, because truth is found inside of God. And thus Jesus Christ is talked about in the latter parts of verse 11 and 12. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. Isn't that interesting, Paul? It's not after man. Well, who's it from? Keep reading, verse 12. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. And Jesus has already told us it came from the Father. The question becomes tonight, where do you want to stand? I have said this time and time again, and I believe it's just as pertinent now as it ever has been. But you take this book from me, and I'm going to sit down, because I have nothing else to say. Just be up here patting my hands because I have nothing else to say. Is it God or man that we want to serve? Is it God or man that we want to please? What do we want to do? So what that leaves us with is an action that we've got to do. Now, there are a couple of these I want us to look at quickly. Just in your minds, Romans 12, 1 and 2. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds by the gospel, Romans 12, 1 and 2. If you remember, several years ago it was hanging right up here. Be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Here's what you've got to do. You've got to be different. And guess what? Different is okay. Different is okay. You not only do you have to be different, but you've got to accept that you're going to be different. You're not of the world. You're called out of the world. Remember where we started in the book of John? You're called out of the world. You have to be different. And being different can only be found inside of Scripture. You've got to be someone who loves eternity. Go with me to 1 John. 1 John chapter 2. Now this piggybacks off where we were just a moment ago, because we were inside of verse 15. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. But what I've got to do and what you've got to do is love eternity, because there's something more important than the here and now. It's eternity. Verse 16, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Listen to this. Is not of the Father, but is of the world. Why do I not need to love the world? Because everything that's in the world, the concepts of man, the realities of man are not from the Father. They're from the world. Verse 17, look at this. This brings it home. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doth the will of God abideth forever. It's about eternity. You've got to love eternity more than you love this world. And let me tell you, if you follow after Christ, you're going to be at odds with some people in this world. I won't stand for abortion as much as I won't stand for homosexuality. But listen to this one. I'm not going to stand for lying as much as I'm going to stand for the other two. I'm not going to stand for sin. I'm not going to support sin. I'm not going to have it in my home. That means I and you are going to oppose the world, because what we've got to do is love eternity more than this world. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a very difficult thing to do. I think you already know that is a very difficult thing to do. And here's why it's difficult. Because what we have to do is obey God. Go to Mark 7. Mark 7 is a beautiful account having to do with Jesus and having to do with people who were trying to trick Jesus, the Pharisees again. Mark 7 verse 3 talks about the Pharisees. Verse 5 talks about them as well, but verse 5 says, "Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, 'Why walk not the disciples according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?'" Now, verse 5 is a beautiful occasion in Mark 7 to tell us that our opinions don't matter. Now listen, I'm a big fan of washed hands. I don't wash my hands as much as some people, and I might wash them more than others, I don't know. But that has nothing to do with my spiritual life. I'd prefer you to wash your hands before you eat. But that doesn't amount to a hill of beans to me. But the Pharisees and the scribes, why don't you follow this tradition? See, sometimes tradition becomes a problem. Why aren't you doing it the way we like it? Oh, now we're getting to the crux of the matter. Look at what Jesus said as you follow in verse 6. He answered and said to them, "O Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'The people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of God, ye hold the traditions of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such things as ye do.'" What was more important to them? Washing of pots and cups. Washing of hands. Now, I know this is going to sound like a weird question, but follow me out here. If my hands had mud on them right now, would that keep me out of heaven? If I ate a sandwich? People wouldn't like it. People would think that'd be mighty weird. And it would be, wouldn't it? But what spiritually was that going to do to me? You know what I'm trying to get you to do tonight in the action? Use your brain. Be level-headed. Use some good old common sense that's not common anymore. The Pharisees needed a good old helping of common sense. All they could see was that thing. That they're not doing what they're supposed to do because the elders would do it. Jesus calls it like it is. I love how Jesus responds to the Pharisees and the Sadducees at times, and this is probably one of the best ones. Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites. Whew. He cut them to the quick, didn't he? Verse 9, he said unto them, "Full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own traditions." What was Jesus telling us here? It's better to obey God rather than them. That's how they would say it in the book of Acts. For we ought to obey God rather than men. It's not what man says that makes the actions of which we should follow. And finally tonight, I want you to see a passage inside of 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. We need to be like Christ. We need to be like Christ. 1 Peter 2:11 begins this way, "Dearly beloved," that's a good way to say my closest friends, my greatest acquaintances, the ones I love the most. "Dearly beloved, I beg you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." Pause before you go into verse 12. What's he asking us to do here? Deny the physical flesh. You know what the world is mainly about? Do you know what the world's really mainly about? It can be based down into several categories, but I think this one hits most things of the world. Do you know what the world is about? Physical satisfaction. That can range in a large number of areas. The physical satisfaction in being rich. If you don't believe that, go look at the multi-million-dollar homes and see how they try to satisfy themselves in those homes. If you don't believe that, go to the Old Testament and look at how they tried to build their veiled homes to make themselves look so good and to be satisfied in them. Physical satisfaction in money. There's physical satisfaction in physical pleasure. A lot of the things that are described by Jesus have to do with physical pleasure. You would be impressed, and you need to do this study on your own time. That's right, study on your own time. You'd be impressed to see how many sins inside of the Bible are sexual sins. or sexual in nature that leads them to the sin. There's physical pleasure in this world. There's intellectual pleasure. There's all these other things. But you know what we've got to do? I've got to learn, verse 11, to get away from these fleshly lusts that war against the soul. Whatever it is that's going to keep me out of heaven, I've got to get away from it. Whatever it may be. And here's the beautiful thing about verse 11. God's already told us about those things. We don't have to worry about where those things are going to come. He's already given it to us. We've just got to do a little studying to figure out what's going on. Now going to verse 12. Having your conversations honest among the Gentiles, that, whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Now let me reread the first phrase of this so we can make application to you and me. Verse 12, having your conversation honest among the world. But read it this way, having your life honest among the world. That's the action that we need. He says that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. There's several thoughts about that day of visitation. Some believe it has to do with the end of time. Some believe it has to do with the coming doom on the nations that are around them. But here's the point. I've got to live my life honest among the world, that the world may see that honest lives can be lived. And that all these fleshly, physical things do not have to be enticed. The action is to be like Christ. He endured every temptation we endure. And yet, with a simple phrase, it is written, He managed to stave away those things. You've seen the world. You've seen Jesus in the world. He's not of the world. The Word's not of the world. And we are not called to be in the world. We're called out of the world by Jesus Christ, who got His information from the Father as He prayed to the Father there, we learned. We've seen the gospel. You're right, the gospel is going to contradict this world. But the gospel is found in that which can give us the truth. And we've seen the actions. We've noticed that we've got to be the people who are different. We've got to be the people who love eternity. I've got to be a person who obeys God, and I've got to be someone who is like Christ. And it all hinges on this idea from Galatians 1 through 12. There's no other gospel. Paul says, I marvel that you are so soon removed to this other gospel, the one that's different. The one that the world says is more popular. Guess what? The world's always going to have something that's more popular than what God has said. Because it's not of the world. This is not of the world. Let me tell you this. This is the crux of it tonight. If we let anyone take us out of this book, then we've found another gospel, which is not another of the same kind. Do you see the point tonight? Whatever it may be that our world is doing, the reason we oppose it or the reason we support it is not because we're of the world, it's because we're out of the world. And the answer to those questions are right here, whatever it may be. You know, our world is going to continue to try to create laws and to create statutes and create judgments to narrow the scope of inclusiveness. But I want to be on God's side, don't you? I'd rather come to the day of eternity knowing that I'm on God's side than the world's side, because I didn't fall for another gospel. I stayed with the words of the Father. Maybe you're here tonight and you recognize that you need to obey the words of this book. You can tonight. One of my favorite passages of the New Testament, Romans 10:17, so then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Doesn't matter what Jonathan thinks. Doesn't matter what you think. I know that sounds insensitive. I don't mean it to be mean. But I started with me first. It doesn't matter what Jonathan thinks. There you go. It matters what the Word of God thinks and what God thinks and where this book came from. Maybe you need to become a child of God tonight. You can do that by the contents of this Word and obeying Him, becoming a baptized, obedient believer of the Word. Maybe you're here tonight, as most of you are, and you recognize there's something in your life that you need to change. Bryce has picked out a wonderful song for us to sing, that old thinking song, to think about our lives, just to see where we are and determine where we're going to be. Maybe you need to come home. Don't let tonight delay. Let's stand and sing and respond to